Today's episode of Market Talk is brought to you by Growmark FS. Keeping up on the latest in ag is a challenge to say the least, but there are experts nearby ready to help. You'll find them at your local FS. You can trust them to bring you customized agronomic grain and energy solutions born of the latest thinking. That's because FS specialists receive continuous training that keeps them current on the latest trends, practices, and technologies. You'll get local expertise that's both exceptional and up to date. Visit fssystem.com to learn how FS is bringing you what's next. And good afternoon. Welcome into Market Talk for this Tuesday, June 1st. Hard to believe we're already in the month of June. Great to have you here with us. MarketTalkAg.com is our home on the web. I'm your host, Jesse Allen. As always, thanks for joining us here for another episode of the show. Find out all of our radio affiliates, all of our streaming sources, social media, everything on our website, markettalkag.com. That's our home on the web. Well, interesting market to say the least here today. We come into the month of June with grain markets exploding higher once again on weather concerns. For the most part, let's talk about all of it. Let's bring in our good friend Matt Bennett with agmarket.net. And Matt, great to have you in here after a long holiday weekend. We come back in here last week. We were down, we were up, and then today we get a weather forecast and poof, that seemed to be the rocket on the back of the grain markets here today as they took off and put some weather risk premium back in.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. You see in North Dakota, you have major freezes, in places all the way over into Michigan. And I talked to a couple growers over there, same types of things going on. Whereas later in the week, this week, they're talking about 90s and possibly into the hundreds, not just a few days later. I mean, I'm glad I don't raise cattle up in that part of the world. It'd be a little concerning for me, just from a sickness standpoint. Regardless, though, they're pretty dry in some of these areas, especially in North Dakota. And I think there's plenty of concern, especially if they're going to turn hot at this point, what that's going to do. At the same time, you hear some private analysts talking about this Brazilian situation and the safrinha crop continuing to be downgraded. I saw an estimate today as low as 85 million tons. USDA, again, is at 103. So whenever some of your Brazilian, outfits are calling for 95 and below, you've got to think that next week's report should definitely show some sort of a downgrade in what this safrinha crop looks like in the total Brazilian output. So it's going to be very interesting. But yeah, you start out the week with major fireworks, touched up the limit. Limit moves with a 40-cent expanded. I didn't think they were going to be a common thing, but last week we had two of them, one up and one down. We've already had one up this week. Let's hope we don't see the one down.
Yeah, no kidding. Definitely don't want to see that one down as we're trying to maybe build a little premium back into this market. I know growers are happy to see it after maybe not making as many sales as they wanted to here with some of those highs we had recently. You mentioned Brazil. I know that's something that we're watching, of course, too. Brazil, for the first time ever, issuing an emergency drought alert for June through September. And I think seeing that come out on top of the U.S. weather situation, that had to make folks go, okay, Brazil, this is serious. They're taking it seriously now, and this crop is getting smaller by the day.
It certainly is, and it's one of those situations where we already have one heck of an export program started for this coming year. Our old crop export program for corn been awfully good, running well ahead of pace. A lot of folks said, the Chinese aren't going to take all these exports. Another 1 million tons they took as of the inspections this morning. We had over 2 million tons that were inspected. Over half of them were to China. So, there's a lot of good things going on here. And if the Brazilian crop continues to be downgraded, you've got to think that the exports are going to continue to grow. And that's at a time whenever a lot of us, including myself, maybe would say that the USDA was a little bit conservative in their new crop export situation. I think they're going to have to raise old crop exports. That's going to lower your carry-in for this next year. I think they're going to have to raise new crop exports. So you're going to need not only this big acreage jump that a lot of folks are talking about, you're going to need Mother Nature to cooperate as well. And that's why a day like today just kind of shows you we're the 1st of June and we're already talking about a weather market. That's pretty early for a weather market.
That is very early for a weather market. And to follow that up, I got a two-part question for you, Matt. The first part of that is, are we going to continue to trade a weather market here throughout this entire month of June, in your opinion? Are we going to continue to see days like today off these, changing forecasts? And the second part of that question is, if I'm a producer, How do I trade a market that is volatile like this, just going off the changing weather forecast, it seems?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer that second question first. And you said, how do I trade it? If I'm a producer, I'm not trading. I'm hedging. And I know you're not saying that they're supposed to trade, but it's a distinction I think we all need to keep clear. Is that in a market like this, we're all tempted. We want to get a piece of the pie, right? We want to kind of get in on the fun. Hey, you know what? Instead of hedging 20 contracts, I might hedge 40 contracts if I think this thing is going to go lower, because I really want to make good money if the thing goes down instead of just simply hedging. Or the other side, the Texas hedge, if you will. I'm going to go ahead and get super long, even though I've got a crop out in the field. We got to be careful to trade this thing. But, what are we going to do throughout the month of June? My personal opinion is today you're probably going to get crop conditions ratings after we record this that will be pretty swell. I think that you'll see a really good rated crop. In my opinion, you might have closed the market quite a bit better today if you wouldn't have been already thinking about what these crop conditions ratings might be. So, the average trade guess, I believe, is around 71% or so, good to excellent. But there's no question that you're going to see, I think, a pretty good rated crop. If you continue to see a good rated crop, and maybe this heat doesn't last too long, my opinion would be that before you get to that the end of June report, whenever we're looking at planted acreage and quarterly stocks, a producer's got whatever strength we see between now and then. Take advantage of some of that, because if you do have a good rated crop and then all of a sudden we get some sort of crazy surprise, and trust me, we've all seen those surprises on these planted acreage reports. If that's the case, it could kill this market for a while. So I like looking up right now. I mean, I don't want to pick on my dad, but he was in my office this morning. We're looking at 580D's corn. And I said, are you going to sell some corn? Because he hadn't sold any new crop corn yet. He said, I can't do that just in case we have a crop failure. I'm like, what in the world are you talking about? You can sell some 580 corn and you're going to be perfectly fine if you sell, maybe you sell 20% of your APH or something, just to get some sales on the books. If that's your worst sale, you're going to have a pretty darn good year. Plus, I got to quantify that. I know what his crop insurance program is. I know he's got insured bushels. If I had no crop insurance, I would understand that, especially if I was in a part of the country where production's not guaranteed. Totally understand that mindset. But where we're at in Central Illinois, buying crop insurance for what we can buy it for, if we're not making some sales and at least quantifying some of the most profitable sales that we've seen in a really long time, in my opinion, we're missing the point.
You talked about, you mentioned North Dakota a little bit and some of the frost concerns we had over the weekend. I talked to someone who traveled through North Dakota, Minnesota this weekend, and they said they were surprised at the amount of spring wheat that wasn't out of the ground. Now, it'll be interesting to see if there was any effects of that up there, but also the dryness concerns up there. And we talk about maybe adding some acres for corn, presumably. A lot of folks are thinking it's going to be some of those fringe areas, North Dakota, parts of that northern plains region that maybe they're gonna move over to corn. But what are you hearing as we're kind of heading into June, heading into that acreage report? Are we gonna pick up corn acres? Where could we pick them up? Would it be a North Dakota area?
That's been one of the main targets we've heard. We've also heard down in the Delta, in the cotton country, we could pick up maybe 500,000 acres of corn. Bottom line, you and I both know printing a 6 on D's corn here a couple weeks ago opened some eyes. I mean, you start talking $6 corn out of the field before you have to make the decision, and it makes the decision somewhat easier. So my personal opinion is that you're going to pick up some acres. When you're picking up fringe acres, and I'm not picking on anybody because I know you can raise one heck of a crop in North Dakota, but typically speaking, when you start to add in the fringe areas, your national yield, it's pretty tough to get it to go up too much because you're not necessarily adding acres in the breadbasket of your super high yielding areas, for instance, the I states. And so, I know some of there's folks in the panhandle of Texas that raise better corn than I could ever raise in my lifetime that are under irrigation. Same thing for southwestern Kansas, some of these Nebraska guys. But bottom line is the fringe areas, if we're going to be adding acreage, you got to be very cautious to assume that national yield is going to be able to get up there close to 180 unless you just have absolute pristine conditions for the rest of the summer.
When you talk about the I states as well, one other thing on weather here before we shift topics, Matt, I was in north central Iowa here this weekend, back home visiting family, as you know, and I know that's a prime growing area. Western Iowa as well. I didn't get out that far, but there's reports of they're dry there. I will say north central Iowa, they're dry. They've got some moisture, but it could turn back really dry really quick there. I saw some creeks and streams that were bone dry in that area. I came through your neck of the woods, central Illinois, things looking all right. I mean, you kind of got that shift, and we've talked about it. From east to west, you get west of the Mississippi. That's where a lot of the dryness concerns are. And I feel like maybe that weather forecast, we got some forecasts in today, that maybe is starting to scare a few traders. What do you think?
I totally agree with you. Some of your major forecasters, I follow 2 or 3 of them fairly closely, and I have a lot of faith in their work. But even they'll tell you, things can change. But one thing that they've all seemed to agree on this year is that if you're going to see some sort of a drought situation, there's a much higher probability when you get west of the Mississippi. Due to lack of snowpack, snow cover in the Rockies, a lot of things going on in the Pacific Ocean. The pool of water out there they're talking about is cooling back off just a little bit, which would lead people to believe that we could be looking for a little bit warmer, drier bias, especially in the western part of the Corn Belt. So if that's the case, there's no doubt in my mind that you're going to see this market very closely watched. Volatility is going to be off the charts. And you could see some extreme swings as a producer. Once again, and people get tired of hearing me say this, but use the volatility to your favor. If you're sitting here saying, man, I'd sure love to get some $6 corn sold, don't rule it out. I know we're not at 6 today. We could be at 6 tomorrow, and if we're sitting at $6 corn, then have your offer out there, hedge off 5 or 10%, be darn happy doing it.
Well, I think one of the biggest things we have to remember, you mentioned it earlier, it's a little early than normal to have a weather market, so we definitely need to keep that in mind and definitely play this market to your favor. Play into your hand with what you have in front of you. Let's move over to livestock. This JBS cyber attack seemingly starting to get felt throughout the cattle markets here today. I know just before we went on the air, slaughter numbers were down significantly. A lot of folks attributing that back to the cyber attack with the shutdowns. Although cattle did settle off the lows today. What is your thought on this whole JBS cyber attack at the cattle market and what we saw today, Matt?
I know they're saying that supposedly it's the same folks that cyber attacked the Colonial Pipeline. They think it's Russian hackers. Regardless, I mean, it's pretty interesting to me. That as we're expanding limits for cattle, that you would have this cyber attack. And whoever's doing it knows what the heck they're doing. Let's just be honest about it. And I would just assume that anybody who loaded up on shorts last week is probably going to be getting a visit of some sort, if they can even be tracked. You and I both know this is a crazy game that these people are playing, and unfortunately, it bit a lot of folks. But yeah, 27,000, I think, on slaughter number was just a pretty paltry number. You've got to think that that's going to change somewhat. I sure hope that they can get up and going here pretty quickly, but definitely a rough start to the week. It seemed like the cattle market was bound to have a little bit of at least support under it. And I would say some strength moving forward. We know that the grills were fired up this last week. We know demand's good. We know box beef prices are strong. And so, to me, I think that once you get past this, and I think we will, you'll see this market heal up just a little bit. And I'm just really thankful to see we only settle off a couple dollars instead of lock down the limit, because a lot of us felt like that was a distinct possibility coming into trade today.
Well, and definitely we don't need any more downside or hurdles for this cattle market, Matt. It's taken a beating the last couple of weeks, and looking obviously at feedlot country, we got a lot of cattle priced out. So you would think we still got that packer margin fight, everything else. There's a lot of things weighing against the cattle market. We need a little positive news, it seems, right now.
We really do, and I think we'll get it. I really do think we'll get it. I think moving forward, I've told you this before, but I do think that this fat cattle market's going to be interesting as we move throughout the year and maybe even into the first quarter. I think that you're probably going to see cattle numbers dwindle just a shade. It's going to be tough for some folks. I would say take heart if you're in an area where you can maybe take a little bit of risk because I think you get rewarded for it on down the road. The toughest part for the cattle producer, which I always say is probably the most faith-based guy in the country, because they got to go out on a limb pretty much every time. But, the tough things is feed costs. And there's no doubt there's no guarantee what feed costs are going to be moving forward. Hopefully you've got them locked in. If you don't, there certainly could be some real angst throughout the summer because of the volatility we were just talking about with corn and soybeans.
On the hogs side, real quick, hogs weathered the storm a lot better Tuesday than the cattle markets did. In fact, trading mostly higher on this hog market. Still, we're waiting on a lot of reports from USDA. They had some reporting issues today. But overall, the hog market looking strong still. And, we're continuing to kind of test those new contract highs. And it just seems like it's more of the same in this hog market that we've had the last couple of weeks here.
This hog market's crazy. I mean, that's all there is to it. Anybody who's stepping in and buying it right now is probably the same folks that's been stepping in and buying it since $85, $90. And guess what? They've been handsomely rewarded. And it looks like there's the potential they could continue to be, but they will be until they're not. And whenever they're not, this thing's going to turn south, and it could be really ugly. Now, part of the reason I say that is because anytime you go to all-time highs like this and you languish around, you always have the potential that you've kind of taken the stairs up and maybe going to take the elevator down. But let's face it, we've taken the escalator up at times. This has actually been a pretty robust rally and pretty methodical, up higher. I mean, every day you think the thing's not going to go higher, and then we go higher. I'm not buying hogs at this point. If I'm someone who's looking to do something, stay away from the hog market is all I would recommend people, because unless you really know a lot about it and you've got a vested interest, be careful there, because it could eat your lunch pretty quick.
Matt, any other final thoughts for us today? Again, pretty much an update in the markets across the board. Anything else you want to add or reiterate, folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think to tie everything together, I said keep flexible, stay flexible this year. There's so many tools out there that if you want to get really heavily sold, and for you, relatively speaking, you can still stay long some calls just in case this market does take off and go higher. You may not get penny for penny the whole move, but I'll tell you what, if you stay flexible and you quantify some worst case scenarios at these price levels, you're going to have a pretty good year.
Matt, I know folks can reach out to you and the team at agmarket.net. You guys have a lot of resources, a lot of knowledge, the app you guys have for smartphones as well. A lot of ways to connect with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Agmarket.app, agmarket.net. You get a hold of any of us. We got all kinds of ways that you can learn more about the markets, and we'd sure love to hear from you.
With that, Matt Bennett with agmarket.net. Appreciate you joining us on a Tuesday. Happy June, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, bud.
Matt Bennett with agmarket.net, our guest today here on Market Talk. Find us online, markettalkag.com, brought to you today by GrowMark FS. I'm your host, Jesse Allen, wishing you a great afternoon.